The mission of the Ukrainian army is to protect the people and territory of Ukraine. And that means being willing to make personal sacrifice for that. The challenge, severalfold. First, the Ukrainian army has to survive the next 18 months. I promise you, a new American administration is not going to leave you dangling like the current one has. Hang on for 18 months, and help's on the way. Secondly, the army needs to embrace the elements of reform. You can't fight a war and do massive reform all at the same time. But you don't also just have to sit on your hands and do the old ways. The army at the front is in pretty good shape. It needs lots of equipment that the West should be providing. But the commanders are good. The Russians have spent the last year training your troops in combat. Okay? So that part's pretty good. The part that needs work on is back in Kiev. You need to create a modern command structure. You need to get people who are leaders and not just sitting behind their desks. People who are focused on the mission, not necessarily their own career. And every army has these people, but Ukraine needs to weed out and get it a little more in proportion. When Ukraine wins, and it's going to win, then the Ukrainian military need to become part of the West. And I don't care whether they join NATO or not. But they have a lot to offer. There are many militaries in NATO who need to understand what's gone on in Ukraine and learn from the Ukrainians. The West needs Ukraine, but also Ukraine ought to be part of the West. That's what this was all about. That's what Maidan was all about. And just because some silly politicians in Western Europe and the United States had no vision and let Ukraine down, and they have the last 18 months, let them down by not giving them military supplies, let them down by trying to push a unenforceable ceasefire on them that the other side routinely violates and receives no sanction for. Just because those politicians let them down, that is not the people of the West. Ukrainians want to be part of the West. They ought to be a part of the West. And pursuing that challenge over the next 20 years and becoming integrated is going to be both a challenge, but also one of the great rewards of this conflict. When I was asking Zabrowski about the raids, he said, well, I said, where did you get the idea? Those were audacious. Those were unique. I mean, and he smiled, that little smile of his, and he goes, well, I was at your Command and General Staff in the United States at Fort Leavenworth, and I took the course there. And I had to do a research paper, and I did my paper on Jeb Stuart's ride around McClellan in your Civil War. It was a raid, and the effect of that raid was basically to totally confuse the Union Army and basically have them quit that campaign. So he said, when I was sitting there trying to think through this raid, I thought of that paper, and I basically put that paper into modern context and implemented it. The last time I was with President Poroshenko, as meeting was breaking up, he asked, is there anything else? And I said, yeah, you need to send General Zabrowski to the United States, to our War College. And some senior officer from the General Staff said, he's already been to your school. He doesn't need to go to another school. I said, no, you don't understand. I want him to come here, not to learn, but to teach. He has so much that we need to understand. He's truly a national asset for Ukraine and for the West. Well, I have lots of stories about Zabrowski. in my discussions with him, but I'll give you a couple that I think reveal the character of the man. When I first met him, and they were sitting on the Crimean approaches, I was with one of his young troopers, a female trooper, and I'd been told that their forces didn't have body armor, but she was wearing body armor. And it was known that Russian snipers were taking aim at Ukrainian officers, so the little few pieces of body armor that were available in those early days usually were given to the officers. So I was sort of surprised, and I asked her, I said, well, oh, you have body armor, where did you, that's cool. And she said, oh, my commander gave me his. I think General Zabrowski is one of the best brigade commanders I've ever met, not just in Ukraine, but in any army in the world, and I've seen a lot of them. He has that unique talent to not only courage, but he's a strategist. He knows where and how to penetrate those defenses and take the initiative and be audacious. And yet, he's caring and a leader, not a manager. He doesn't sit behind a desk. He's out at the front leading his troops. And I can't think of anybody that I've met in Ukraine who's better qualified to lead and design the Ukrainian airborne forces for the next decade. Russian army is bigger than the Ukrainian army for sure. On the other hand, it's important to realize that they're not 3 meters tall. They're not nearly as large as they were at the height of the Cold War. They've gone from 210 divisions down to 80 brigades, a fraction of the force. The Russian army, the ground forces, are only 50% larger than the Ukrainian armed forces on the current level of mobilization. So they're not 3 meters tall. They have good planners. Their general staff, I believe, is one of the best in the world, to be honest with you. They have good equipment. It is more modern, better than what Ukraine has. They wanted to have an all-volunteer force, but they could never afford it and could never motivate people to join it, given the way they were treated in particular. And so what they have is one of the worst infantries in the world. So it's a strange mix. So what do they do with those conscripts? Well, they basically, in the Ukraine conflict, have left them home. What they found out in Georgia, for example, is they weren't well trained. They didn't want to be there. They took lots of casualties, and their mothers cried and raised all kinds of issues, political problems at home by sacrificing their sons. So they put in this hodgepodge of other people's infantry in these units, separatists, some well-motivated, and particularly those that have been taken back to Rostov and trained, good troops. They fought well. Some local yokels, not well motivated, not well trained. You get the zombies released from jail, they get some drugs and some vodka, and they go out and get killed. For important missions, they put in their volunteers, their Spetsnaz, their airborne, their naval infantry, their elite troops. But that's a weakness, not a strength. If you look at where they're bringing these battalion tactical groups from, they're bringing them from all over Russia. There are battalion tactical groups that are coming from Sakhalin in the Pacific. The guys who finally took Donetsk airport were Marines from the Kola Peninsula. In their battles with Ukrainian forces, they've lost probably a regiment of the 76th Airborne Division at Pskov. So they're squandering some of their most elite troops. So, yes, the Ukrainian army has taken on one of the toughest armies in the world, or largest, and they've done very well. The reason I stress that the Russians aren't 3 meters tall is there's a tendency for people to be defeatist and say, whoa, the Russians are so big, little Ukraine can't stand up to them. Well, they have for a year. The first time I went into Kiev, people told me, various foreigners who were in Kiev said, oh, we don't think the Ukraine army will fight more than 48 hours. I had Russian generals tell me that in the spring of 2014. Well, they have. They've been fighting for a year. And they've acquitted themselves well. They've lost some battles, they've won some battles, they're still holding that country, and there's a lot of fight in them left. Several things. Raw courage. They were willing to put their lives at risk for a higher cause. Secondly, they were well trained. Maybe not trained enough, but trained better than everybody else, and that made a difference. Third, they had great leadership. And fourth, that leadership had audacity. They had the willingness to not just react, but to do the unusual, to find the weak spot and to exploit it. And that is a mentality that is not taught, that comes from only a very special breed. Well, there are 5 functions of raiding operations typically. One is to throw the opponent off his game plan. Particularly Russian style of war, they tend to be very good planners. Their general staff does excellent planning. I think it's one of the best planning staffs in the world. Their execution tends to be very methodical. So if you can throw them off your game plan, it really causes consternation on their side. Secondly, they're focused on attacking you. And so if you can put threats against their flanks or overrun their rear area, all of a sudden everything goes crazy and people know what's going on. And that has happened to them a number of times, and they're very insecure about that. The third, and I think this is going to be really important in the future, particularly with all the air defenses that the Russians have brought in. So they basically shot the Ukrainian Air Force out of the skies of its own country. With all those air defenses, you can't just have the Air Force running around in there. So what you have to do is do what we call in the West SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses. Part of that is coordinating your air with your artillery. But the other part is raiding operations, which you do like Sharon did in the 1973 war. The Israeli Air Force had been thrown off its battlefield. But Sharon went in and, with a raiding force, started taking out the air defense sites. As he took out the air defense sites, that opened quarters where the Israeli Air Force could come in, and then you had a true combined arms operation. Another function, and I think this is also one the Ukraine needs to give consideration to, is not just have a raiding force, but the raiding force is a spear that is the leading edge, the cutting edge, and behind it then comes a strong second echelon with armored forces so that you can break in and, rather than trying to encircle an opponent, you find that weak area, punch in and go to the heart and the center. The airborne assault forces can lead that, but it has to have the weight of a full armored advance behind it. And lastly, you start doing those, you demoralize the opponent. And already that's happening. I mean, Russian troops basically don't want to be in the Donbass. That's why you see Chechens and zombies and everybody else, because the Russian conscripts go, I don't want to go there. When you operate in a raid or a deep penetration of the opponent's rear area, you face really 3 big issues. First one is getting in. It takes a real strategist to figure out how and where do you penetrate that line. Sometimes it's a breakthrough, but other times you operate dispersed and then reassemble your force once you've gotten through the lines. But that how one gets in is critically important. Secondly is staying focused on the mission when you're going through. It's very easy to get diverted and get caught up doing other things, or you run into opposition and you're then worrying about fighting that opposition as opposed to achieving the mission. And that mission can be everything from just destroying things to confusing the enemy to actually going in and wiping them out. So that mission can change a lot. And the third is being able to get your troops out. It's one thing to go running around the enemy's rear area. It's something else to be able to survive. You know, the Romans had a thing they called the grass crown. And And when a Roman general would have a big victory, they would go back and have a big parade in Rome. But the grass crown was provided by the troops. And they would go across the bloody battlefield and pick up the bloodied straw and weave it into a crown. And they gave that to the commander because they believed he was responsible for their victory. And so when you look at what Ukrainian airborne forces did, in my view, they won the grass crown. They went in the right place, they did what they had to do, and they got their troops out. Well, there's three that come to mind. One is Rommel's breakout of the Western Front against France in 1940, when he broke through the Ardennes and cut across the rear of the British Expeditionary Force, collapsed the Allied line. A second, which was more in the size, Rommel had a whole corps behind him. A second, which was closer to the size of the Ukrainian units, General Patton, the famous American tank general, launched a raid of about 150 kilometers to Babelsberg to free some prisoners of war. And it had similar characteristics to the kinds of raids the 95th Brigade has done. But I think one of sort of equal comparison is what General Sharon did in the 1973 war. The front had been broken open, there were two major Egyptian armies, and he inserted a small force, originally just 6 tanks, across the Suez and drove deep into behind one of those armies and was able to wipe out their rear area and basically create an end to that war. Those would be 3 raids or 3 deep penetration operations that I would view as equivalent to it. By far, I think the total length of the raids, if you want to call them that, of the 95th Brigade and then later added with the 79th, far exceed the depth of the others. It was really 2 actions. There was the action in late July, early August when the 95th cut through separated the separatist lines. And then after Ilyevaisk was the counteroffensive they did. It had characteristics of a raid operation, but it was really a counteroffensive. And it didn't just go in and come out. It went in, did the job, and stopped that offensive. The unit that I've observed the most is the 95th Brigade. And so I'll give some examples. On my way into Ukraine, right after the conflict started in March of 2014, there was a YouTube video of the 95th Brigade, which was Ukraine's first unit to respond, pulling out of their barracks, heading to try and cover the front of Crimea. And I watched this video, and there was a small group of people, family, local people watching, not many, not a parade, it was kind of a rainy day, and this small set of vehicles start coming out, a BTR here, mostly trucks, ragtag. I looked at it and I go, oh my God, that is what's going to try and stop the Russian army? I was really in a state of shock. Week, 10 days later, I was down with the 95th Brigade. They had already in their position on the isthmus going into Crimea. And I was walking around with Mikhail Zabrowski, the commander of the 95th, and I was looking at their positions. I said, where's your artillery? And he said, well, we're airborne. He said, come on, I'll show you. And he showed me they had these real cool automatic 82 millimeter mortars. But I said, where's your heavy artillery? He said, well, we're airborne. We're heavy. So, well, where's your tanks? I mean, Russians have a large armored force that can come across this. They said, well, we just have some anti-tank weapons. We're airborne. We don't have tanks. And I was stunned. And I go, how long can you hold this position? And he looked at me, this boyish grin of his, he goes, until the last man. And I'll never forgot that. In early July, I watched the 95th take Slavyansk, along with the Special Forces. I was really impressed at the way they were operating. They were using combined arms. They were using adjacent artillery. They'd added some armored vehicles. And it was not only their aggressiveness in fighting the opponent, but their sensitivity in not attacking civilian and really trying to avoid civilian casualties. It left a really, and they acted decisively and with great grace. I then was with the 95th after they'd made their great raid from Sloviansk down through Debaltseve and cutting to the south to the Russian border, taking Sarmagula, and then coming back through. And also after they had made their raid, which wasn't a raid, it was a counterattack against after Ilyevaisk to keep the Russians from pouring through. And now this wasn't a light airborne force. They had 3 infantry battalions. Several of them were on BMP infantry fighting vehicles. There was armor all over the place. There was a whole battalion of tanks. There was more tanks than the battalion's worth. They had heavy artillery. So I turned to Zabrowski and I go, I thought you were light guys, airborne. Well, where'd you get all this stuff? And he smiles. He has a sort of boyish grin. He says, we're assault troops. How we get there depends on the mission. So this mission required us to be an armored assault force. And so we acquired the armor. And he said, and we found some along the way. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, here's let me show you a Russian tank that we collected along the way. Then we went and looked at the artillery part. He brought back several dozen pieces of major Russian equipment that the Ukrainian forces were now using. So I turned to him and started teasing him because he Mr. Light, and all of a sudden he's now Mr. Heavy. I said, well, when I go back to the United States and I tell people about what you've done here, and they say, what do they need? What do you need? And remember, Zabrowski had served had gone to school in the United States and had also served with U.S. forces in the Middle East. So he says in very clear English, he says, I want American M1 tanks, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, multiple launch rocket systems, Apache helicopters, Predator UAVs. And I go, so much for light force. And he said, give me that and I'll clean this mess up in 2 weeks. Ever since that conversation, I've made it my life's mission to provide him with those equipment, and I won't quit till I do.
The Russian offensive.
Following the debacle at Ilyevaisk, the front was blown wide open. There basically was no defense left between the suburbs of Donetsk and the suburbs of Mariupol, except for a couple strong points. The only thing that stopped those Russian forces from pouring through, driving to Crimea, driving to Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk, or cutting behind like the Russian war plan calls for, and cutting off the Ukrainian army by seizing Kharkiv. The only thing that was going to stop that was an emergency force. And the only force the Ukraine military had were elements of 2 airborne brigades. The 95th, which was way up at Sloviansk, and the 79th, which was actually in the rear area being resting from some earlier battles. Within hours, they were deployed down to the southern front. I'm sure in their hearts they desperately wanted to get to Ilyevaisk to rescue those caught there, but it was too late. So they didn't have the resources to be able to either break through the Ilyevaisk or put a string of permanent defenses in between Donetsk and Mariupol. So instead, they went on the offensive. They went on offensive not as airborne forces, but as assault troops equipped with tanks, artillery. They drove into the rear of the Russian forces, hit them from behind. And if you look at the maps of where they maneuvered, it's unbelievable. They moved left, right, back and forth, overrunning the Russian rear area, overrunning their supplies, causing absolute havoc in the rear of the Russian and separatist forces. I know of nothing else, and it's miraculous that it succeeded, to be honest with you, but I know nothing else that would have stopped that breakthrough had they not done that. They were literally the plug in the dam that not only stopped the water flowing out, but actually drained the dam because it took away all the steam and the pressure, because the Russians then got caught up trying to deal with their own insecure rear area. It was truly one of the most decisive actions in the Russia-Ukraine war to date, and history will remember it as such. There are also certain things the airborne shouldn't do. There's a tendency in many armies that because they're parachutists, they wait around not being involved in the conflict until there's an opportunity to parachute. Or sometimes they'll parachute just to show off that they can parachute or jump out of helicopters. That's a function, or that's a specialty they have, but they need to focus on the mission or the function and not just be limited to that very narrow role. Secondly, airplanes and helicopters are increasingly vulnerable. So airborne forces shouldn't be tied to the vehicle of how they get to the front. Ukrainian forces demonstrated, I think, to the world that airborne forces, when they're equipped with armor, artillery, can operate in the depth of the enemy's rear and succeed beyond all expectations. So that role shouldn't be tied to a particular means of transportation. Lastly, there's a tendency, given they're a fire brigade, to throw them into some position, like an airport. And then they go in and hold the airport. And they're good. They're well trained. They're motivated. They're used to being surrounded. The problem is that then you've taken one of your best mobile forces, your best trained, who have the psychology of operating in the opponent's rear area and seizing the initiative, and stick them in a static position. And that's a loss. So all of those factors need to be taken in and treated carefully. I believe that airborne forces are the most professional units in any country, along with special forces, but I don't believe that they should take on every mission and be prepared to do every mission. They should focus on the missions that they do best and that only they can do. What are those? First of all, they got to be the country's fire brigade. When there's an emergency, a danger, a threat, they have to be ready to be the first ones to go there. Secondly, they need to be trained to operate in the rear area, independently, autonomously. And that is a very tough, demanding challenge. Third, the airborne forces can operate on a highly dispersed battlefield. Ukraine has 2,000 kilometers of potentially hostile border, not just vis-a-vis Russia or the separatists or Crimea, but Transnistria and even the whole Belarusian border. There's Russian troops in Belarus. Somebody needs to be able to screen those areas and be able to react very rapidly. So that serves as a mobile reserve. Those three functions, fire brigade, operations in the depth of the enemy, and serving as a mobile reserve, those are critical, unique talents that the airborne have. If it wasn't for the airborne forces of Ukraine, this war would have already been lost. Now, I don't want to take anything away from all the other services, the specialties, all the troops, volunteers who fought so bravely in so many different places. But when the rest of the army was trying to get ready, they couldn't even get out of their barracks. It was the airborne forces who went and secured the causeways from Crimea. It was the airborne forces who went and defended first Kramatorsk, then Luhansk, then Donetsk airports to keep the separatists from being able to use those as major resupply centers. It's not accidental that it was the airborne forces operating with special forces that had the first major victory in retaking one of the most important cities in the Donbass in the Battle of Sloviansk. It was the airborne forces, the 95th Brigade, that cut through in July, late July and early August, and cut through and was able to separate the Donetsk and Luhansk people's republics to keep them from being unified. Actually cut through and were able to relieve Ukrainian army forces strung along the border. And probably most importantly, when the front was blown wide open after Ilyevsk, and there was nothing to stop a major Russian offensive to go all the way to the Dnieper. It was the 95th Airborne Brigade and the 79th Airborne Brigade that rushed in and defended the front. There wasn't enough force to put in a linear defense. There wasn't even enough force to defend all the little towns. So what they did is they went on the attack. They hit the Russian penetrations from the side and the back, overran their artillery, overran their headquarters. And it was that action that totally discombobulated the Russians that basically stalled that offensive from being a strategic defeat. Unfortunately, it's not well known, but as that story becomes better understood, the reputation of Ukraine's airborne forces and the troops that participate in that is going to be known worldwide. What's interesting about the hybrid, or what the Russians call new generation warfare, which they're perpetrating on Ukraine today, is that it has a lower end to it, less intense operations, more unconventional operations. Almost every Ukrainian brigade commander I've talked to tells me the most important battle, and the first battle they fought, they lost, and that was the information battle. Traditional soldiers don't think of the information war. They don't think of building the hearts and minds of people and so forth. So that's a role even airborne forces probably for hybrid war, are going to have to emerge and develop more. On the other hand, the three attributes of airborne forces, seizing the initiative, operating in the rear area, and having a combined armed force, are magnified in this kind of war because it's operating on a very dispersed front. You need to act extremely quickly and decisively. You can't wait and operate like traditional slow-moving armies because the other side can outmaneuver you if they see you coming. But you still need to be able to call in and have those additional combined arms assets so that when you take on an opponent who has modern equipment like the Russians, reasonably well-trained, you can actually have a chance of decisively defeating him. We need to differentiate between the specialty of a service and the function that they perform. Obviously, the specialty of airborne troops is that they drop out of the sky. So they are delivered by airplanes and they're trained to parachute or they rappel out of helicopters, and that's their unique specialty. But that's only half of what they are. The other half is their function. And their function is assault troops. And that's different than a normal army. Assault troops are trained to seize the initiative. Traditional armies tend to be reactive. They react to threat of aggression by moving to the border. They try to create a defense against the opponent. If they're going to do an offensive, it takes a long time to prepare. Airborne troops have to seize the initiative quickly, fast, with speed. Secondly, they're operating behind, they're trained. Their mentality is to operate behind enemy lines. That is very rare. That's very hard to inculcate, that being willing to operate without an umbilical cord back to your support. And third, unlike, say, special forces, which also have those two roles, they are a combined arms unit. So they are capable of operating with armor. They are capable, they bring some of their own artillery with them. So they're able to multiply. We call it in the West a force multiplier. They're not just infantry, they are a combined arms force with strength that can be reinforced and operate as a mechanized or even an armored force. Those are the three unique functions of the airborne. And so we need to realize that their role is not just dropping out of the sky. That's a form of training, that's a form of discipline. That's a way of separating people who have an aggressive spirit and the courage to take high risk from your normal person. But then you want to put those unique kind of people in a special unit. Paratroops in all the armies of all the countries in the world are elite. They're volunteer, almost exclusively. They're extremely well trained, and they jump out of airplanes. So by its very nature, that act makes them unique in their military service. in terms of the role of airborne and any elite troops, particularly in Ukraine, but for all countries, we need to think of an army as a spear. I call it Achilles' spear. And we typically say, oh, the elite forces, the airborne, are the cutting edge of the spear. But we also need to remember what is the rest of that spear, that shaft. Well, it's made of wood. It usually isn't as finely honed material as the spear. But it consists of three parts. It consists of the rest of the army. Without the rest of that army, that spear point is just a sharp knife. It won't penetrate. It has no range. It is almost ineffective. The middle part is the part that supports the army, the general staff, the logistics, the people doing research and development. And the last part of that spear is the society. Those forces need the support of the society, and society needs to know that they support them. So if we go back now to the front end of that spear, it's sharp, it's the strongest steel, it's the most honed. But without the rest of that, it's relatively ineffective. So people frequently ask me, well, why can't all the forces in a country be elite forces? Well, for one thing, you can't afford them. It's too expensive to have everyone trained in that. So you'd end up with an extremely small army that can't control their own territory. So the unique role of these elite forces is literally that cutting edge. But that cutting edge without the length of that spear is very limited.